Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. I want to thank my sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. So here's an episode for your listening enjoyment.
PSA grader notes. An interesting turn in grading. Grades were something I always liked, and this is taking it to the next level of actually being told what to look for. Dr. Beckett, subgrades, grader notes, your thoughts?
Newsflash, BGS had subgrades 25 years ago. But this is an excellent move on the part of PSA, and I hope they do it for all the cards, but it's an additional expense. It also suggests an additional scrutiny of the cards and taking longer with the cards to make the notes. Anything that provides an educated buyer to know what they're buying is good for long-term health of the hobby. So hats off to PSA.
Just to clarify, grader notes for every card graded. Right now, they're
they're doing that, but that's where it could go. And people,
exactly.
When you're paying big bucks to get something graded, you'd like to have more than just a number.
Without a doubt, especially with the dollar values for some of the cards today, people get very worked up, and I think you get reputations as a grading company, and this hopefully at least gives some explanation. Now, the next step is if you get feedback, where's it coming from? It's coming from the actual grader. And from the article I read, they've been instructed not to write a paragraph, but just a quick note, dimple, top left corner, stuff like that.
It's a good thing. A lot of other companies have followed suit. BGS is one of them. So it's welcome that PSA is joining that boat. We're going to do that as well. It is interesting, even though you get the notes, you can't share that on any platform. You can't share it on eBay because that's considered proprietary information, part of their terms and services. I'm curious how long that'll last. I think eventually that'll also be a challenge, and eventually I'm thinking we will be able to have the public information. So I'm wondering why they're holding off on that now. Maybe they're just trying to see how the program unfolds and how much information they really can give. But I think it's great. I've heard a bunch of people say, I don't see anything wrong with this card. This looks minimum 9, should be a 10. Why is it a 7? This gives clarity. It takes away a lot of confusion from the hobby.
It also reduces their top line and it reduces their bottom line. It reduces the top line because when you get back your card and it's a 9, now it's not a 10. They saw it. So you're not going to send it back in. And you've gone to additional time and effort to add cost to the grading of that card. But they've added a mystique to it by making it only available to the submitter. Then the submitter's got an edge on somebody else. It's my card. I have the inside scoop, and nobody else knows that this is not a card that could be resubmitted for a higher grade because they've already now identified that it has that dimple in the upper left corner.
And we won't get into what they could do to solve that dimple.
What's going to happen is that somebody is going to cross it over. They're going to get a 10, and they're going to thank Kurt's Card Care for eliminating the dimple.
It's part of the reason you wonder if they're holding back on the public notes, if that's the reason for now. But my understanding is this is all in their software. They can flip a switch and make these public. It's only a matter of time till you put in the barcode and you'll get not just the stats on the card, but you'll get the grader notes with it as well, and that'll all be public. Orlando says all graders do grading notes, but they never shared the information. From the article I read, they only really entered it into the main system within the last couple of years, that they might have been done in a different manner. But as far as formalizing it digitally, when they updated their software in the last couple of years. I hope that grader notes speak to the positive qualities of the card, not just the flaws.
The way some people look at grading, but not the way the companies look at grading. When you're auditioning for graders to hire a potential grader, you're not seeing if they can notice the positive qualities of the card. You're seeing if they can notice the flaws. The whole process of grading is what is less than perfect. The report card evaluates each of those. But to that question, it's probably going to be the case that the grader notes will not deal with all of the 4 subgrade categories. So they might not say anything about centering if it's perfect. But if it's off-centered, they may say that. If there's a problem with the edges, if there's not, that won't be in the grader's note. So that would be my guess.
I always appreciated the subgrades on the Beckett cards. Do you know what year that started?
99.
99, so 25 years later.
The beginning. We were slow getting started. We could have started a year earlier, except one of the key things was the holdup, developing and refining the process of what the subgrades would translate into a final grade, because it's not an average, as people have eventually noticed. Obviously, if you get 4 9.5s, you're going to have a 9.5. But if you have 3 9.5s and an 8.5, that might be a 9. But it seems like it ought to be a 9.25 or something, but it's not.
Is there a mathematical algorithm, or
no? It's not mathematical.
The rumor's always been you can't be a half grade above the lowest grade.
That's a principle that is true most of the time. I'm not sure it's true all the time. The dilemma we had is that some of these rules don't apply equally in the high end toward the mint as toward the poor. If something's an absolute perfect card, except for a bullet hole in the lower left corner, it's a 10, 10, 10, 1. And does that make it a 1.5, Danny? That's an eye appeal card. Just don't look at the bullet hole. It's a BB hole. Maybe it's a pinhole. As soon as you make hard and fast rules, there can be exceptions. But that's the basic principle.
What was the reason for discontinuing the subgrades? Were they discontinued? Not that I'm aware.
No, there was option. You could
opt out. You do have to choose to pay.
They allowed a discount. If you don't want the subgrades, we won't charge you as much. That was not under my regime, because I love the subgrades. I think they're part of the service.
Grader notes, Dr. Beckett, can you elaborate on the extra time it takes?
I'd like to say it takes 4 times as long, because you're grading the card in 4 different ways. It doesn't take 4 times as long, but it takes longer. I think that's part of the marketing problem that BGS has, is that they're probably the slowest and most thorough graders. It needs to be positioned, which it was originally, as a premium service. It takes longer, but it means attention to detail. Time was spent on each of those 4 aspects.
Horacio, if you had to pay for the grader notes on a value submission, would you pay for the upgrade?
Yeah, absolutely. It gives me information I can have about my card.
Dr. Beckett, you touched on this, but does this affect the strictness of the grading?
No, it doesn't matter for 10s, and they don't have 9.5. So if they send back a 9, they're going to be able to tell the person of a good card. They're going to tell them, here's why it didn't get a 10. That's not necessarily stricter. If they give it a 9 with no explanation as to why it's a 9, or something that seems flimsy. But here's an example. Okay, so they got a 9, but there was some wax residue on the front of the card. Then I'm going to crack it out, and I'm going to wipe off with my finger the tiny bit of wax residue that's on the front of the card, and then resubmit. That's something that was not intended to be on the card. That's on the card from the factory because of the wax of the wrapper, if it's a vintage card.
Would PSA take that as a regrade? If they're able to have a digital footprint of the card and they know that this card's been graded and it's been a 9 before, and now it's a 10, would they be able to grade it as a PSA 10?
Again, if the grader notes say that they put it a 9 because it had wax residue on the front of the card, I think PSA would accept it. And if they wouldn't, SGC or BGS or CGC or any of them, it depends on your definition of doctoring. And in our industry, it's not okay for the graders to improve the card that's sitting in front of them, to tweak a corner, to wipe a piece of dust off, perhaps even, which I don't think is so bad. But they're articulating what the problem was. Admittedly, you're sending back the same card, and they'll smell it. I think they're going to do a lot more smelling of cards to see is there any foreign substance on there that remove that wax. If you use some chemical, which you don't need to remove the wax, then yeah, you should get bounced.
But microfiber doesn't have a smell, so if you're just rubbing it off, that should be a no-brainer that you can send through. Are the cards reviewed by 2 people? Is there somebody who checks it from a macro level after it's gone through a detailed grade?
Above a certain price point, the price of the card, if a card is $1,000 or more, absolutely there's got to be a second person looking at it, and not just the person that's doing the slabbing to say, oh yeah, that's the same guy that's the name on the label. No, there needs to be a verification, a senior grader, 2 senior graders even, depending on the value of the card and the rarity of the card. I believe that's just good sense. If something's a base card and it's not very expensive, then let her rip.
What's the average time it takes a grader to grade a card? In my mind, it should take a good 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm guessing it's nowhere near that.
No, I think it takes 15 to 20 seconds. With the amount of cards that PSA is grading and the number of graders that they had, that might change depending on how many graders they've hired. But at one point, if you saw the numbers from GemRate, right, how many cards PSA was grading, and you had this awareness that they had somewhere between 120 to 150 graders, realistically, they can't be spending more than 30 seconds on a card.
I did an episode with Greg Morris, a couple episodes about a year ago, and he can grade cards in 2 seconds. Now, he's not putting a number on it, but he makes piles by the words of the grading. He is super fast, and he puts it on eBay with his VGX or X Mint or Near Mint, Mint Plus, whatever. He can do it in a couple seconds. It doesn't take very long to get your first impression, which is what he goes with. But when you're paying $15 to get something slabbed, you're closer to what Horacio is saying. It's not 5 or 10 minutes. It might be 5 or 10 minutes if it's a Wagner or a 52 tops mantle, where you've got a whole bunch of people coming in and looking at it. But for the run-of-the-mill card, it's way less than a minute. Modern cards, why BGS was doing so great back in the day, is that modern cards take a lot less time than vintage cards. Modern cards, you're trying to figure out if it's a 9.5 or a 9. With a vintage card, it could be 5, 6, 7, 8. There's a lot more finesse, and it's just way more difficult to do vintage. So if you're doing a bunch of base cards, chrome and paper, either one of them, generally the corners are fine, the edges are fine, the centering is obviously fine or not. So it comes down to the surface. The difference between a 10 and a 9 or a 9.5 and a 10 is the tiniest kind of a scratch or fingerprint or something like that. But that doesn't take very long if you have the kind of lights that BGS has, and I'm sure all the others have, is it blue light, black light, regular light. If you put light on something, you're going to see if there's an imperfection.
When you look at your card to decide whether to submit it, how long do you actually spend on the card deciding whether to submit it? You spend significantly more time than the grader did.
No. If you send it in and it's at least a 9, but it might be a 10, that has to be what you're thinking. And that takes 5 seconds, tops. To look at a card and say, I don't see anything wrong with it, but maybe they will, put it in the pile to submit. Or it's a vintage card that has reasonable centering, reasonable corners, reasonable edges, reasonable surface, whatever. In the 50s, you're looking for 5s or greater. In the 60s, you're looking for 6s or greater. In the 70s, that takes less than 5 seconds.
With all due respect, you're slightly more talented than the average person.
If you have one card, you're not going to spend 5 seconds on it. But if you have 100 cards, it'll average out to where it really doesn't take very long. Actually, if you've never submitted a card, then you need to go to a bulk submitter. And the bulk submitters in 5 seconds a card could say, you don't want to submit this. You do want to submit this. It's not a skill that requires 60 years of hobby experience, Danny.
These graders, they become so good at it, right? That they can take 20 seconds to look at a card. After a month or two on the job, you get really good at it. And you get trained well. Then you go from there.
Orlando, this is fantastic. He attended SG grading school, and the final exam grade was 10 cards in 20 minutes. Grader notes and catch one altered or fake card. There's another aspect we didn't bring into it, was identifying fakes, and that speaks maybe more to the high value cards and more eyes on the higher value cards because people don't fake commons. So they're looking at roughly 2 minutes a card for a brand new person.
But that's not the standard for them. They're looking for graders that can find the flaws, and they're giving them plenty of time to do that. You can teach speed. They can speed up later. But if they can't see the flaws in 20 minutes, then they're not going to see it in 2 minutes. If they can't see the flaws, they flunk the test. In fact, if they're sitting there thinking, is this a flaw or not? I'm telling you right now, if you think it might be a flaw and it's your card, it's a flaw. If you're saying, I think this corner is soft, is it really soft? If you think it's soft and it's your card, it is a soft corner. It's not a 10. Or I had a little damage here on the edge, but I don't know about that. Okay, that's how you flunk the grading test. You pass the grading test by in 20 minutes, you've identified all the flaws and especially identified the either counterfeit, altered, something like that. That's a really big deal.
How much incentive is there on speed? Financially,
the incentive is to keep your job.
No, I mean, do the grading companies pay more if you're faster?
No, you can't do it because we dealt with this. Is that I'll tell you, the slowest guy we had was our best grader. It's because he got all the more obscure cards. But the guys that were the more junior graders got a lot of the base cards. They could get a lot of speed going. You can't pay people based on speed. But if you don't have speed, you have to have that ability to see the flaws and to do it quickly. And if you can't, you're going to have trouble keeping your job. There's an esprit de corps that we got to get these cards done, but we've got to get it right. And if you've got a problem, you got to tap the person next to you in the cubicle with the special lighting, and you got to say, hey, can you take a look at this? Because I want to make sure I get this right. And you got to have esprit de corps where the dude sitting next to you or the lady sitting next to you doesn't say, hey, mind your own business. I'm doing my own cards. I want to make my quota, and you're slowing me up. They got to say, hey, I'm going to take one for the team occasionally. I'm going to make sure we, as a collective group, get it right. And I hope all the grading companies do it that way.
By the way, Orlando, when he went to the grading school, said the cards were pre-graded by Andy Broom, who's the head, and you had to detect the flaws. He said he had a colored 71 card, barely detectable.
Veteran collector would get that, because as soon as I would see a 71 tops black bordered card in a grading test, I would think, oh my goodness, let me get out my black magic marker. But with the right kind of light, which I'm sure they're equipping them that, because you may not be able to see it with a naked eye.
To your point, if you're using a 10 times loop with good light, you can grade a card in 20 to 30 seconds.
The man